and I'm the community manager Africa at Climate Tracker. I just want to invite you all to the second edition of the Africa Community Hangouts. Thank you guys for coming in. In this segment, we're going to be talking about COP26 and what happened at COP26. We're going to be talking about how it affects us as journalists and how it affects civil society as a whole. We might also be looking at possible policy changes in the days to come or in the future. I just want to let you know that this is a live event. So we're going to be live tweeting this. If you want to be part of it, just use the hashtag community hangout, or you can tag us at climate tracking on Twitter so that we can retweet your comments about the community hangout. And today with us, we have three amazing speakers who are going to be covering various segments of this discussion. So we're going to begin with the first speaker, Dr. Ferrell Adam. Dr. Ferrell Adam is from South Africa. She's an environmental justice activist and researcher who has worked on energy and water issues for more than 15 years. She's an energy and climate change campaigner with a focus on nuclear energy. Today, she will be providing her overall reflections of COP26 through an African lens. She will try to answer the questions, where do we go from here? And she will share with us her projections on how civil society will be impacted. So thank you, Ferrell Adam, for joining us. The floor is all yours.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna just put my video on just so everyone can see me and I can say hi to everyone. Thank you for inviting me to be on your panel. I have a presentation, so if you're okay, I'm going to go straight into that and just share my screen. Can you allow me to share my screen, please? Great, thank you. All right. So, yeah, so I've been asked to look at a reflection of COP26 through an African lens, and where do we go from here and how civil society will be impacted. But to do that, I'm just covering some of the key things that came out of COP26, and because I think that then decides where we go and how we take that forward. Joyce, just to say if there are any questions, I can't see my screen, I'll have to look at them at the end if that's okay. All right. So a quick glance. I mean, I've been following COP negotiations for a very long time, and it's almost the same in the beginning. You know, the first week, there's a lot of hype, and media journalists are talking about this is going to be the one. This is going to be the one where we're going to have so much done and we're going to solve the problems. And then the second week, that it's almost bipolar, where the second week everything falls down. Everyone's really gutted, and there was nothing different about this. Although with this COP, right, the way we see it is it is one of the most exclusionary COPs so far. And the reason for that, of course, was because of COVID. Now, in September, when they were calling for people to submit or to apply for badges, only about 3% of adults in Africa had been vaccinated. So that in itself tells you the challenges that we're facing. So what we found was that and many civil society organizations went forward and said, we can't go ahead with this COP. A lot of people can't make it for all of those reasons. And they didn't listen and they went ahead. And so someone said it very interestingly. She said it was the whitest COP ever. And another person basically said that, you know, they opened the doors for the fossil fuel lobby. And I'm not sure if you were following or anyone was following, you'd know that there were over 500 delegates from the fossil fuel industry and fossil fuel lobby, and it was more than any country. So that in itself speaks a lot, you know. So and that will feed into my presentation. The words at the bottom there says, with so little global South representation, it is no surprise that wealthy countries are pushing through false solutions, but also because they have the business lobby en masse attending COP. So if I'm not always very excited about COP. I really don't think that that's where we're going to get change, but I'm going to just discuss some of the things that came out of it. So very quick overview. I will go into each of these points. These were the 5 key things. The one was carbon markets. There was an agreement finally reached under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. There was, the 1.5 target and ambition was undermined, completely undermined by the nature-based solutions and the whole talk of net zero. And I'll go into detail on all of these. And for the first time, fossil fuels were mentioned in the text, but it's very weak. I mean, and that's the thing with civil society, we're like, oh, yay, they've included fossil fuels. And then we realize, no, actually, it was just, they pulled the wool over our eyes, right? And almost nothing on the table to increase climate finance, including issues around loss and damage, which is really what we're dealing with. And I'll come back to that. There were a slew of announcements, I'm sure, and some of them seemed really good. But so, for example, we're going to stop deforestation, but actually, when you look at the plans, it's actually quite weak. There's no actual kind of timelines, and it's got lots of loopholes and caveats, which allows for business as usual. So let's go to the first one in terms of carbon markets, right? The agreement on carbon markets will likely undermine chances of staying below the 1.5 degrees because it allows for high levels of pollution to continue, and that's the reality of emissions. And so they talk about carbon sinks, plantations, lands, ecosystem-based sinks in other countries to offset their emissions. And this is not where we need to be. We need to be at actual zero of emissions, not net zero. And from the organization that I work with, Friends of the Earth Africa, our position is we oppose carbon markets because they do not work to reduce emissions. They cause great harm to communities. And given the current state of the climate, they cannot work to avert 1.5 degree increase. So regardless of the safeguard. So for us, it's very concerning. And it's almost kind of a greenwash across the whole climate change challenges we have. It also allows rich countries, and as I said, corporations off the hook. So if they have weak net zero plans, they open the door to nature-based solutions. There's land grabbing they talk about deforestation, but there's a lot of land grabbing. And then, of course, human rights abuses in the global south, which we know about. So the carbon markets issue, as we said, was not great. It was what was one of the key outcomes, but for us, it wasn't that great. So yeah, this is just some intermittent. I'll show you some photographs that come from the COP26, and this is one of it, where people were saying net zero is not zero, and that is important, right? The 1.5 targets, yeah, I mean, like I've said it a few times now, it's completely undermined. Things have changed here and there, moved here and there, but it really does not deal with real emissions cuts. And so we're not going to stay within the 1.5 degree target. And that's a problem. This is a repeat of everything I've said already, so I will carry on. The one thing that's important is that, for years of attending COP, I remember in the beginning, to get historical responsibilities and common but differentiated responsibility into the text was hard work, not by civil society, but by people, like-minded people within the negotiations, and that's been removed from the text now. As I mentioned, fossil fuels were mentioned in the text, and but it's weak, so it's put in, and I think it's significant. It's significant that we're now saying fossil fuels cause climate change, and it's there. But the text does set the stage for clean power generation in the guise of coal, and carbon capture and storage. And carbon capture and storage is not proven. And if you want to ask me questions about that, that's cool. I can answer that. The text allows continued fossil fuel use, only calling for phasing down, which leaves it open to the possibility of coal usage with carbon capture and storage for much longer. It also allows for continued fossil fuel subsidies, only calls for phasing down. And by focusing on coal and not including oil and gas, it's disproportionately focusing on China and India, right? And that's the reality. So that if you just take the world politic and you can understand that. And outside of the formal negotiations, as I said, there was a slew of announcements. The Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance and the fossil fuel financing announcements, more than 20 countries have committed to ending public finance on fossil fuels by the end of 2022, which I think is quite significant. We'll have to follow that through and see if that was just words. It's not enough to just have great words and text. We need implementation. So nothing on climate finance, as I've mentioned. It has failed to deliver on finance and loss and damage. And for us, for countries in the developing world and in the South, we know that we need that, right? We need help dealing with the devastating consequences of climate change, and that's the reality. They agree to give us some funds for technical assistance, but they won't budge in paying for the actual damages that are caused by climate change, and that's what pushes us back. And this is the thing that's really worrying, is they suggest 3 years of dialogue, 3 years of conversation to actually do this. And really, I think the time for conversation is over. We are experiencing climate impacts as we speak. Now, I've got in my last point there, I said, remember vaccine apartheid. So if we look at COVID and we look when, like the height of, like when things were really bad, let's take 2020. And what had happened was developed countries had the money and the know-how to then buy out all the vaccines. And it left us in the South having to negotiate and beg and go in hand and say, please, can you give us some vaccination? So that's the reality, right? So when we are faced with a pandemic, when we are faced with a challenge, it is clear the developed world is going to look after itself first. And for us in the developing country, we're just going to be, we're going to be the ones that are going to bear the brunt and, experience the issues, the impacts much harsher. And so that's something so if they behaved like this with COVID, it was a very telling about how they will behave when things get worse. And climate change is here, it is going to get worse. And they are going to start, what if they stop sharing food? What if they cut off water? And I wouldn't put it past them. I mean, we saw that with vaccines. People needed vaccines for life and they had not been sharing. But anyway. So some of the announcements that were made, they were basically grabbing headlines. But if you go into it, it was very weak. I mean, one of the countries was South Africa that said they had this money coming from the UK, US, and they've had this agreement. But we're going to be unpacking and seeing if that's going to be funding, more coal and how it's going to be working. And some of these announcements have been described as empty calorie announcements, that it's there, but it has no substance. And so some are better than others and do give scope for further pressure and action, but it's a start and we have to monitor this as civil society. We have to be very mindful of these kind of announcements that they now know they can go and make their look great, get investments, and that's what they're doing. But in actual fact, it's very weak. And some of the announcements was the deforestation pledge, the coal pledge, end of fossil fuel finance, Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, and some issues on agriculture. And we know that some of that was all very, very weak. In summary, though, from all of that is that the outcome of COP26 leaves developed countries free to keep polluting. And it also gives it the green light for massive land grabs and for offsets in developing countries. So they want to come in, take our land, continue polluting, continue with emissions, and we the ones that are gonna be affected. So some people have described it, and Friends of the Earth has described it as a betrayal of global South countries, particularly because we could not all go there, and you know, COVID, but also the abandonment to the climate crisis with no money for the energy transition, adaptation or loss and damage. And that negotiation for finance is not new. It's been going on for a long time. They commit to something and nothing gets actually added into the bank account. What was really, we always saw fossil fuel companies and fossil fuel lobbies at COP. We saw them. They in government delegations. I know in the South African delegation, we had Eskom and Sasol. But it was just the extent, the numbers was just shocking. Well, it wasn't shocking, it shouldn't be shocking, but the numbers of people from the fossil fuel corporation is quite telling. And when you look at the text, and you look at the wording of the text, you can see that it's actually more business speak than it is a developmental kind of focus on how we deal with impacts of climate change. And so the deal that they all shouting about, in our view, could increase global emissions, and you know, the weak commitment to net zero by mid-century, the inclusion of great sounding nature-based solutions, you know, it just means more emissions rather than less. And the irony is everyone is now, and they all agree that climate change is real. There's no denial, but I do think that we still have a long way to go. So, you know, how do we move forward as civil society? How do we deal with this? And I think the one thing that we have to do is we have to continue organizing wherever we are. And I think local organizing, connecting to bigger groups. So, and to build on this about nothing about us without us. In South Africa right now, we've got Shell, who's planning to do some seismic blasts in our ocean. And I think that the linkages between different organizations, doesn't matter on ideology, has to strengthen this campaign. And that's something we as civil society also have to understand, that we're going to be weak if we cannot build a stronger movement based on ideologies. So yeah, we need to reflect on COP, but I also think that COP is not where we're going to find significant change. We also, as civil society, need to critique. And I got there, I don't know if you can see it where I say, oops, sorry, I didn't want to move, is defend the comma, because we get so wrapped up in a sentence and defending, you know, renewable energy. I know we need renewable energy, and I know we can have renewable energy, but we must acknowledge, we can't hide away from the fact that there's some environmental damage. It's not obviously compared to coal, oil, and gas, but hiding from it is not going to make it any better. There's definitely inequality between civil society participants and government of the southern countries. So we know that that's there. We need to, you know, work around that. How do we strengthen those voices from the south? And COVID-19 is not going to be the last pandemic and outbreak that we see. And we need to understand, or should we be going to these negotiations if these things happen? And I think that there wasn't a strong enough opposition. So that's why it allowed the UK government to go ahead with it. We need to increase work locally. That's what I was saying, collaborative. We need to build a movement. It's a very weak, fractured movement at the moment, in my view. There are pockets of it, and it's fine to have different movements, but they're not talking to each other. And we need to work towards environmental justice through our own practices at a grassroots level. And that's we need to practice what we want to see. And, you know, I think also while we talk about these things, and while, you know, we talk about COP and it's high level, it's negotiations, governments coming together, But I think that the impacts of climate change are forcing ordinary people to change. It's forcing the way we see the world. It's forcing how we do business. I mean, the pandemic in itself is an example of how that has happened. I've got cabbage banded there because in South Africa during COVID, there was a man who started planting vegetables, cabbage and other vegetables on his in front of his house, so that people could come and it was a communal garden, you know, food garden. But he got arrested. He got arrested because the police decided that you can't plant vegetables on the sidewalk. It's it's an eyesore. And so he got arrested. And of course, people came to his defense and the charges were dropped. It was ridiculous. But it has this, you know, it has affected him. But I think it's also made other people realize that we're going to have to change the way we see things. We're going to have to change the way the world works. And slowly, I think people on the ground are doing it. And then, of course, I think importance for us in the African region is COP27 is going to be in Egypt. Whether or not we go, and you know, that depends on a whole range of things. But I think that it is a time. You know, I don't have a lot of faith in the negotiation itself, but because it's on the African continent, it does give us a chance to spotlight our issues and to make our voices louder, which is always drowned out. You know, if you think about the last few COPs, it was always in European countries and for a range of reasons. And I think this allows us to highlight our voices above others. And I think that's going to be really important, that from now until December, we really have to ramp up and make sure that our voices on the ground are being heard. And this is this was a protest in Cape Town during the week of COP with the Global Days of Action, and linking the different issues of violence around ecocide, femicide in South Africa, and bringing different movements together. So this is just a picture that says we have to continue locally organizing, etc. Of course, we have a colonial statue in it as well. And that is my presentation. I hope I was okay and in time. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Ferial, for your take on what happened at COP and your overall reflections. I think it's a much needed perspective. We need to be able to analyze, you know, what has happened and what we can do, you know, in time for COP27. In line with this, I would like to ask you a question. What would you like to see from COP27 in Egypt?
So the truth is that I think that, you know, a lot of the talks, it doesn't matter. Like I could say, we need more commitment. We need to make sure. Oh, sorry, you on my video? I'm sorry. We need to make sure that, you know, the kind of blockages we experienced this year, especially around finance, is pushed forward, and that there's some real commitment on loss and damage. And I think that is going to be important. But also for me, as I said, I think that the negotiations are too slow for climate change. Climate change is not waiting for us to come to an agreement. What I would really like to see is that the organizations within the region actually come together to highlight the issues here. And that, if the focus is on the real impacts of climate change, I think that that's important for me.
Okay, thank you so much. We have a question from Anne from the Access Coalition. She would like to know your take on the fully conditional NDCs that many sub-Saharan governments have submitted. Do you feel that they speak to the commitments of these governments or to the polluter, the polluter pays principle in one way or another?
So thank you for that question. And I think that that's the whole thing with the NDCs, is that this COP also allowed them to review their NDCs, and there isn't a lot of countries or a lot of commitment to actually reducing to an actual zero. And so, yes, you're right. It does feed into the polluting industries much more, and the fossil fuel industries.
Okay, so we have another question from Emmanuel. He asks, so from the outcomes of COP26, developed countries did not honor their pledges. What's next? What is next for African countries?
So that's my concern, and that's the concern of also Friends of the Earth Africa, is that we can't, like I say to you, we can't depend on the solutions coming from COP itself. We're not going to get what we need in this region from COP. So we have to build our voices, and we have to build our kind of, the civil society has to be stronger. We're weak, we're very weak, and some of these things is partly our fault. We have ideological differences, and we fight with each other because we don't like how someone looks. Let's not beat around the bush. There's politics within civil society that can just drive you insane as well. So I think we need to pull ourselves together, because while we're also doing our own politicking, people on the ground are starving. And I think it's going to be like COVID, when people like literally start dying in numbers, that maybe then people will come to understand the realities of what we've been asking for.
Okay, so for our last question, we have another question from Anne. She's saying that in your experience attending COP, has there ever been an opportunity to develop a common quantified goal on financing as has been proposed? What mechanism was being used to contemplate climate financing once the $100 billion goal was committed?
So I'm not sure I understand the question. I think I need to just read it. Sorry.
Okay.
What do you mean? I'm not sure what you mean by a common quantified goal, because there was a common goal for financing. Yeah, the 100 billion. So I'm not sure. Could you rewrite your question?
Yes, and could you please rewrite your question so that we can address that later on in the program? So thank you so much, Dr. Feria Adam, for all your insights on COP26. And we hope that moving forward, as we are presenting to some African journalists, that we can all sit down and come up with a solution moving forward. Thank you so much once again. So moving forward, I would like to introduce my second speaker for today. So our next guest speaker is Senami Koja. Senami Koja is an award-winning multimedia Nigerian journalist who has reported in conflict zones across the country. She has more than 6 years of experience telling underreported stories, and she's also Climate Tracker's Africa manager and has supported many of Climate Tracker's online fellows throughout COP26. So today, Senami will be discussing with us on what happened at COP26 and what we need to know as African journalists. So Senami, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Joyce, and hi everyone. It's really nice to see members of our community. It's one thing to have conversations, and it's it's another thing to see people in real time. So thank you all so much for joining and coming on. And I think that was an amazing presentation by Dr. Ferriel. I think she captured a lot of what I was going to say, but I'm just going to go ahead and add a journalist perspective, right? Because we deal with journalists, and we saw firsthand the experiences of journalists as they were reporting from COP this year. And so I think one of the biggest things that stood out to me in this COP was that it was not on the front pages of newspapers or news websites or news organizations in Africa. And for me, this is very concerning. This is concerning because before COP, there was a lot of talk around, again, just like Dr. Ferriel has said, this is going to be the COP, right? That change is going to happen or action is going to happen. And we all know that us on the continent are disproportionately affected by the issues that were deliberated in Glasgow. And so there was expectations as regards the coverage around COP. At least I know I had expectations around the coverage of COP, but I recognize the challenges, and some of these challenges presented themselves. And I think it's good to introspect and see what happened, what went wrong, and how there can be opportunities at the next COP to have conversations around it. And I think the first challenge for a lot of journalists, even beyond the pandemic, was funding. So on a good day, on regular days, a lot of newsrooms in Africa struggle. A lot of journalists, I know there are a lot of journalists on this call today, and I know that, you know, unless you are funded by grants, unless you are funded by the states, maybe you work for a state-owned news outlets, funding is a huge challenge for most media organizations. And so this translated when it came to reporting around COP. There were not, enough resources to allocate to journalists to say, hey, you know, we want this to be the priority. We want this to be the agenda for the next 2 weeks. We want to send journalists to Glasgow to report on this. Newsrooms who are struggling to afford reimbursements around data costs or even around electricity for their employees. Yeah, how are they going to afford flight tickets? How are they going to afford all these other things that were required to report at COP? And I think that played a significant challenge in the way that COP was reported, and that translated to the newspapers. Again, the COVID-19 pandemic is another critical issue, right? Because it has taken up, or it has guzzled up, most of our front pages. There was a study recently that showed that most news organizations were now reporting, or are now reporting on the economic and the socioeconomic recovery around the pandemic, and how we move on post-pandemic, and other issues such as conflict and so on and so forth, that there's little or no room for the reporting of anything else. And I think this is also concerning, because I believe that the climate crisis is an emergency on any scale. It's on par with whatever crisis or conflicts. And I know that a lot of African countries are in conflict and are in dire straits as well, that we're experiencing in our respective countries. But the pandemic was very brutal, and it created chronic inequalities as regards the way that journalists on the continent reported from COP. And so there was vaccine, the issues of vaccines. There are people who had not had access. I remember when we were assessing the applications that we received for the fellows who eventually reported at COP, both virtually and those who reported in person. And I think that there was a part for those who were shortlisted. There was a part where they were asked if they had access to the vaccine and if they will have access to the vaccine anytime soon. And that was supposed to be also as part of prerequisites for travel, and how they were able to get out and even get back into their own countries, because even countries on the continent have these restrictions around, if you travel to, if you travel to this place, you can't come back unless this and that. When you come back, you have to pay for quarantine fees and all of that. And so we had those challenges, and that alone, caught a lot of people from the process. And I think it's unfair, right? Because there are people in developed nations who have access to vaccines, who have access to these resources, but due to politics or things that are, I would say, in my opinion, trivial, they've not been able to fully utilize. And then there's people on the continent where, again, climate change affects us disproportionately. And, we need vaccines for our people to be able to carry on with our lives, to be able to even survive. And, we didn't have access to that. We had corrupt leaders who also would not care or will not even care about doing that. So that also affected, it also translated at the end of the day to the fact that there was not a lot of people who could travel in person to COP. And then for the arrangements that the UN made around reporting virtually, I think that was, that was very challenging as well. I can see that we have a few of our online fellows on the call today, and they had a lot of challenges just accessing that, understanding what to do, how to stream it. A lot of people had concerns around buying data, for example, and just accessing and being able to stay up to stream those events and all of that. And I think that a lot of that was not taken into consideration around the planning. I think that the organizers did not work with journalists did not consult with, at least with journalists on the continent, because our situation is unique, it's peculiar. And I don't think that our nuances were considered when the structures were being set up. And even if it was considered, I don't think that we were given exemptions or we were given opportunities to be able to fully maximize those platforms or take advantage of them. I think another thing that was a challenge during reporting at COP was the gender imbalance, that was very, very visible, especially from my end, right? So again, I refer back to the process of shortlisting. And in Africa alone, I think we had about 519 people who applied from Africa. And of that number, I think only about 9 were women. And for me, that was really concerning. And I think that when we have conversations around things like education, around things like equal opportunities for women and girls, it seems like it's just talk or it's just conversation. But when you are at the other end of managing opportunities that people can have access to, these things play out, and then you see it in the bottom line, you see it in the numbers of people who apply for opportunities. Climate change affects women more than it affects any other group in society, and for women not to be represented in the storytelling around climate change, or not to have had the opportunity to go to COP, report at COP, or even have virtual opportunities to do so, was a big concern for us at Climate Tracker, and was something very worrying to see at the back end. And so I think that is something that also played out on the continent. And I think that going forward, I mean, we have a few years, before, we have a few months, I beg your pardon, before the next COP. And so I think that civil society organizations who are interested in bridging this gap, I think that this is a very unique opportunity for them to find specialized solutions around women participation in events like this, especially women who are journalists, and so that they can participate and tell stories that matter to them and how climate change is disproportionately affecting them. Another issue that I think that newsrooms, or another thing that I think that newsrooms focused on was that they prioritize global narratives. They prioritize global announcements. Say, hey, Boris Johnson has said this, or hey, Joe Biden has said this. And what about your president? What about your leader? And again, this also ties into my next point, which is the hostility that a lot of African leaders had towards journalists. We had instances where, the president of, Nigeria, for example, was very evasive of journalists, and even their itinerary at COP was being treated like some top secret thing. And a lot of African countries had this challenge, or a lot of journalists from African countries had this challenge. So even those who could make their way to COP did not have access to sources, they didn't have access to their country's leaders, or even when announcements were made at the, so that it's not like they're reporting, PR, you understand, or just announcement or empty promises by these leaders and by people who are making vague and broad commitments at COP. Sometimes I hear this commitment, I'm like, wow, you're going to end deforestation. Is that true? Because based on current realities, it's just not feasible, right? In the time frame that you're proposing and with the resources that are available. And so there were no opportunities for journalists to challenge these narratives that were coming out of COP. There was no opportunities for journalists to have one-on-one interviews or press conferences to sit down with these people and say, hey, you said this, but I don't think this is true. I fact-checked you and I did this and that. And I don't think that this is realistic. What do you have to say about it? There was no room for that. And a lot of African leaders, even back home, are secretive about their activities because they are mostly, let me not say mostly, because some of them are corrupt and they don't want the activities scrutinized. And I think this also translated to COP, and that journalists, especially from Africa, they don't have access to their leaders in the way that people, our counterparts from the West did, to be able to ask the hard questions, to be able to challenge these promises and pledges that were coming out of the conference. Another thing that I think was a barrier for journalists on the continent, or that's featured very prominently, was the unavailability of sources. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not like there are no people in civil society like Dr. Farrell who are doing the work on the ground, who are experts in this issue or who can speak. I think that there was a disconnect, or there has been a disconnect. And I think it also ties to my first point, because reporting about the climate crisis has not been at the front burner of the African news agenda. Sources have not been cultivated in this regard. And so for many newsrooms across the continent, this is a fairly new genre. This is something that's, is okay, the rest of the world is going on and on about this, so we must report it. And even when reports are done around it, there's nothing critical that's happening. It's just he said, she said type journalism. There's no, unless you find stories that are funded by organizations for investigations or on niche topics, that is where you'll find deep dives. But beyond that, there's no one that's really telling the stories and with the human angle, or how it's affecting people, and what, or holding government accountable, as a matter of fact, as regards their plan to combat climate change. And so I think that sources was a very big challenge for journalists, reporting on COP, amplifying voices that it could. I know they're the Vanessas of this world, and they are the Mr. Olumide Idowus of this world, but I found that there was no centralized source base or source bank or resources that African journalists could tap into. For most people who were reporting from the West, they have universities that have experts, or they already have faculties and departments set up to research climate change. And so on their websites, they have meet our expert sessions, for example, or a section on your website that says meet our experts, and they have ability. I mean, it's just the experts are accessible to people in that part of the world, but we do not have such infrastructures here yet. And I think it's also a very big opportunity for again, civil society organizations like Climate Tracker to key into that and to try and find a centralized source bank, if you will, that will curate the names of experts and journalists who can grant interviews to people who will be reporting at the next COP. I think another thing that was a huge barrier for a lot of the journalists that we saw was the divide between those who could speak English and those who could not. And I find that very worrying as well, because when the discriminates whether you speak Arabic or French or Portuguese, whatever other language is spoken on the continent. And so I feel that even though some journalists from Africa were given access to report at COP, or had the opportunity to report at COP and to report on some of this issue, some people did not have their foot in the door. And I have a interesting analogy to describe this. It's just if you're an able person, for example, you can access any building if you want. You can just walk in and walk out, take the elevator in, take the elevator out, take the stairs and all of that. But if you're someone living with a disability that affects your mobility, for example, you need a wheelchair, and unless you are in that shoes, unless you are in that situation, you'll not understand, or unless you've seen someone struggle with mobility when it's time to get into the door, you'll not understand the need for people who have access. So it seems like, African journalists are starting to report about the climate crisis. African journalists are trying to get starting to get their voices out there. But even within us, even within our sub-regions and all of that, there's still barriers that we need to dismantle. There are ways that there are things that we need to dismantle. So we have to find a creative way to bring everybody to the table, whether you speak Arabic, whether you speak French, whatever language it is that you speak. We have to find a way to ensure that it is not Eurocentric conversation, that it reflects our true voices, and that we're able to tell the stories that matter to us. And so I'm just going to stop here. But before I do that, I'm going to talk about some of the opportunities. I think I already mentioned a few of them that I think that journalists can key into ahead of the next COP that will take place in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. And we hope that we'll see a lot of the people on the call who are here today, dear. For the next COP, I think that African journalists should start cultivating sources beyond the work that civil society and organizations such as Climate Tracker can do to curate a source bank or create places where you can find sources. I think the climate crisis is important, and that journalists should treat it like every other crisis, just as they'll report on armed conflict or as they'll report on, whatever other press or politics or sports, whatever other things that take the front burner of our newspapers these days. And so I think it's very important as a journalist to start thinking ahead in the next few months. How do I tell these stories? You can have a target, you can set a target for yourself and say, hey, every month I want to do at least one climate story. And in the process of doing that, you speak to people, you reach out to people in your network, you can reach out to people like Joyce, a climate tracker, for example, and she'll put you in touch with people, and when you do that for 12 months consistently, you will have 12 good climate stories, and not just 12 good climate stories. For every story, you speak to at least 1 or 2 or 3 sources for your stories, and so you have that to your credit, and you're able to also share that with colleagues in your newsrooms. You're able to share that with people in your circle and in your sphere of influence. And so I think that's something that is an opportunity for journalists to start doing ahead of the next COP. Another thing that I think is important is for it to happen is for newsrooms to redesign their news production methods or packages. And I think that this should reflect in the things that take precedence on our front pages. I know that a lot of you on this call today are journalists, and so I challenge you today to go back to your newsrooms and have conversations, talk it out with your editors, make them see how important it is. And I think, and I've also found, even in my own reporting, that one of the ways to get people to care about the climate crisis is to humanize the story. People care about a story when they can see how it directly affects them, or how it effectively directs their mother or their sister or someone that they love, or even their immediate environment. And so find ways to make that connections in stories when there are wildfires in your community, when there are flooding in your community, if you live in a coastal area, if your friends have not been able to catch fish that they used to catch in the past, find those connections and tell those stories. And that way people can begin to understand why the things that are happening, and then they can begin to hold their government accountable for more action towards mitigating the climate crisis. Another thing that I think can be done before the next COP is just to keep platforms like this open for conversations to continue to happen. I think that more conversations need to happen between civil society and journalists, because we can't do this alone as journalists, right? We need, because our newsrooms are struggling when it comes to things like funding, resources to help us tell the stories that we need. But we have non-governmental organizations who provide micro grants or mini grants, or even just grants, full-blown grants that can help you tell the story. So reach out to this organization, say, hey, pitch this organization, send them an email. I found that they're always responsive. Because this is such a small community, especially on the African continent. And I think that anyone who is in a non-governmental organization or civil society in this space is always excited to have a conversation with new voices and new people who are offering solutions to changing how stories are told around climate change on the continent. So reach out to people who you are people who even invest in telling climate stories in other parts of the world. Ask them, do you fund climate stories in Africa? Can we set up a wing in my newsroom? And you fund it, and then we're accountable to you and tell you that, hey, we've done all this. But even while you're doing that, you also have to be conscious about the interests that you're representing or that you're reaching out to, so that it doesn't cloud your journalistic integrity. I think these are a few things that I have to say about our experience telling stories at COP, and I hope that they are useful for you. I hope that we continue to have this conversation, and I hope that we begin to get ready as if the next pandemic is going to happen. I know we're all planning and all of that we had issues with diversity and accessibility during the last COP. But what if another pandemic happens in January, right? What if COVID 2022 happens? What then? What resilient structures are we putting in place that will ensure that we're still able to tell the stories that we want to tell, regardless of pandemics or changes in our environment and so on and so forth. So that's all for now, and thank you so much, Joyce, for having me.
Thank you so much, Sanami, for sharing your views on how we as African journalists can, let our voices be heard and even overcome some of the barriers, that we may face moving along and even looking up towards COP27, which would be in Egypt. You mentioned something about women's voices not being heard, about the opportunities that women have. So I just wanted you to answer that question, on how we can allow more women to have voices. What can we do as organizations? What can we do as journalists? How do we let the voices of a marginalized gender to be heard? How do we do that? Sorry, you're muted.
Yeah, no worries. So I think that's one of the greatest ways to overcome these barriers is policies, right? In-house policies within newsrooms, within organizations, right? It's easy for, anyone can will to have anything. I want the world to be 50-50. I want women to, be the president of this organization or this and that. But I believe that the only way to enforce true change and have accountability for the change that we're advocating for is by mainstreaming policies into our organizations. And so for an organization like Climate Tracker, for example, a conversation that will need to happen or can happen will be to say, hey, in our next round of fellowships or around climate stories, or in our next fellowships for people who report at COP, are we having specialized announcement or call out or call for applications for women, right? Things that encourage women. Are we reaching out to newsrooms to say, hey, nominate 2 women from your newsroom to be a part of this event? I found that a lot of women don't have, they cover news stories. I know that journalism is a profession that is saturated with women. They're just not reporting on climate. And so, what you can do is to incentivize them, and even beyond incentivizing them, once people have told one story about climate change and they have a byline about it, and it's something that they've been through the process and they've seen first. And again, journalists are human beings, right? And journalists care about the stories that they tell. And so when you see how your story can be impactful to the artisanal fisherman who's losing his source of revenue, or to the animals who are losing their habitat, or the people whose environment have been degraded by oil spillage and all of that, then they are concerned, then it becomes a priority for them. And so I think that's, special targeted fellowships, announcements, events that is aimed at women will help to level the playing field. And so when you've made that type of investment for the next 6 months, the next 9 months, when your next call for fellows comes up, you've already groomed, a couple of female journalists who are ready to report on climate stories, or who have sources in the field, or who feel that they are capable enough or have received mentorship and training to be able to do so. And so then they apply to be able to take advantage of these opportunities. And so then we don't have 500 men applying for, and it's not a bad thing for men to apply. If you're a man on this call, we love you and we want you to keep applying. It's just that we need more perspectives, in our stories. And so when you have that, you have more people, and then the field is level. And then so if you're selecting 10 people, you know that you're selecting 5 women and 5 men, and the field is leveled across the board. And so I think that is one of the ways to just be intentional. I think that is the type of even in our newsrooms, right? If you're an editor on this call, I think that is something that you should start thinking about as well. If there's an assignment around climate, and you can find a way to rotate it in your newsroom, or give priority to women who have shown interest, or you think will be great at telling these stories, and assign them to these stories. Let them go on the field, get it. And once they start building a profile in telling climate stories, then it's easy. Then they can apply for, because a lot of these opportunities I've also found do not take into consideration some of these factors, right? And not just the ones that are advertised or put out by Climate Tracker, just a lot of opportunities that are targeted at Africans ask you for your work samples when you are reporting. For most people who don't have it, that is it. They're already cut off at that stage. So if there are opportunities for people to build their portfolio before these big opportunities come around, and to have links and work samples, then I think that in the future, more African, both men and women, but especially women, will have more access to this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Sanami, for giving us your take and possible solutions that we can come up with. I'm sure everybody here would keep that in mind, and then we can look forward to COP27 and how we can align ourselves together to take advantage of the opportunities that would come out of that. Thank you so much. So I just want to remind each and every one of you that this event is live. So you can tweet about it, you can tag us at climate tracking, or you can hashtag us at community hangout so that we can retweet whatever you tweet about this event. So our next and final speaker is Onke Nguka. Onke, just let me know if I mentioned your last name correctly. So Onke, welcome to this event. I'd just like to give a brief background about Onke. So Onke is a reporter, is a South African reporter, and she reports on the climate crisis and the environment with the Daily Mavericks, our Burning Planet unit. She was also one of our in-person fellows covering COP26 in Glasgow, Scotland, and she'll be taking us through her experiences and also some possible policy changes that have come out of COP26. Welcome, Onke, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Joyce, and hello to everyone else on the call. As Joyce mentioned, my name is Onke from the Daily Maverick. I'm based in Cape Town, South Africa, and I was at the COP for the very first time, and definitely a mix of emotions regarding the experience. I think that, first of all, I expected it to be very chaotic, and it was. But also I think very confusing. Also, a lot of the journalists that were there had mentioned that this was not the best time for a journalist to have their first COP. And I think a lot of it was definitely related to a lot of the restrictions around COVID. So basically for journalists not being able to enter certain plenary rooms where important announcements were taking place. And I think to a great extent that for me didn't make sense at the COP because there were so many people within the venue that were roaming around, no one was social distancing. Obviously the mask was mandatory, but the whole excuse of journalists can't enter a room because of space and COVID restrictions for me was very contradictory to what I was experiencing on a daily in terms of the common areas where social distancing regulations weren't being withheld. But I think, I mean, in the larger view of everything, I think I realized very quickly that there were 3 different COPs that were going on. First of all, there was the COP where the formal negotiations between countries were happening. And there was the COP where only the activists were kind of participating and meeting amongst each other. And of course, there was the COP outside of all of that where it was just the announcements all the time. And I think for me, I had gone to COP with the expectation that, okay, well, I'm going to report on all of the important announcements that are going to take place. And because, those are this is COP, this is set to be, and it was tutored very well before the event that this is going to be the most ambitious COP. There's so many voices rising around climate activism and climate crisis, and the evidence is growing so rapidly. And, with that being said, I think there was this large expectation for it to be very progressive. And I was like, okay, I'm gonna report about like all the headlines and all these great progressive announcements. But I think about midweek into the first week, I was very disappointed to see that these announcements were very empty, missing a lot of detail, and that the announcements that they were making were actually there to kind of push the agenda of this being a successful COP, and the COP actually being, this progressive tool that countries can use to come together and create change and impactful change towards the climate crisis. And I think there was also an expectation from, the leaders to use the media as their mouthpiece in doing so. And I quickly realized that that's you know, as much as I am a young journalist and I'm still learning, but it was a very shaky place to be in, because there's your newsroom, which is, you know, this traditional media place where, you know, they want the announcements, they want the big headlines, they want what the big hitters are saying. And I think my newsroom is very balanced in allowing me the space to actually write about what I was experiencing and report on what was actually happening. So giving me the room to actually write about what was going on outside of those announcements. But I think for everyone else, and I also got caught up in this, to be quite honest, in the announcements, to be like, hey, this is happening, like, yay, and, you know, environment. And I think for me, it quickly turned from, you know, reporting about these announcements, because you hear the, you know, 131 trillion towards net zero, and you hear, you know, we're going to end deforestation by 2030, and you get so excited and you want to write about it, and you want to be like, yay, you know, this is going to be the headline that's going to get me out there, but also this is the headline that's great for the environment. And I think I quickly pivoted from that to point out that actually these announcements are taking place, speaking about, you know, matters that are particularly affecting the global South. And the global South is very much missing from these conversations. The global South isn't there to actually participate and be fairly represented in the decisions and announcements that are being made, but also that when the announcements are being made, they're expected to participate in signing pledges. They expected to take part in taking part of the commitments. So for me, it was, I think my reporting was also came from a lens of wanting to highlight that, to say that, okay, well, this is what they've announced, but also they've announced this without hashing out the details. They've announced this without considering how developing countries are going to carry out these commitments. They've announced this without saying that, oh, okay, well, we haven't met, you know, the 100 billion, and therefore maybe developing countries shouldn't take part in this pledge because they don't have the climate financing to do that. And so I think it became very important to tie that into the stories and to highlight that, and to highlight also just the inequality that was within the space. I found myself as one of the very few Black women that were in the newsroom. And for me, that was very disappointing, because I think it raises a question of who is telling African stories, whose voice is being heard when African stories are being told, and also why are Africans not being allowed to tell their own stories? And obviously, you know, as the speakers before, Dr. Adam and Tsunami had mentioned that, you know, there was a lot of vaccine apartheid, and it became very clear, you know, just being in the corridors of the venue, that, you know, I was just constantly bumping into these white men in suits, you know, white women in their heels and pencil skirts, and, you know, everyone was well dressed, I'll give them that, but, you know, the African colorful attires that I was expecting to see there were just missing. And the faces also that are dressed in that were also very much missing, and it was reflective in the newsroom. It was reflective in the corridors. And, you know, I worry about because journalists aren't allowed in the negotiating rooms between countries, I worry about what that looks like within that space. And I think if we're going to conclude anything from that, we can see from the final agreement that, you know, those voices were very much missing. I mean, the final text doesn't really make any progressive steps towards the African continent. It doesn't make any progressive steps around developing countries. And for me, I mean, it was, as I said, it was really important to highlight that. And I think my newsroom, you know, we are traditional and we do want the headlines, but I think we made a very bold step in actually taking a COP story and making it a front pager. So there was a story that I worked on towards the end of COP, because South Africa had gained some financing for their just transition, and from the EU and Germany, France, the US and the UK. And, you know, for South Africa, that was one of the biggest takeaways. But I think I quickly realized that, first of all, this amount is not enough. Second of all, this amount, why are they only targeting South Africa? And there was, you know, in the news that, you know, this is supposed to be the blueprint for developing countries on how, you know, developed countries can fund their just transitions. But it's also just like, well, okay, can we not rather do this, have different examples across different parts of the continent, you know, I mean, different parts of the world on different continents. And, but I mean, sorry, I'm being a bit sidetracked, but in telling that story, I have a colleague who was in South Africa, who was an online fellow for Climate Tracker. And basically what we did is I reported from Glasgow and said, well, you know, we've had this announcement in South Africa. This is what they've said it means. This is how the deal is going to play out. And this is what the deal is going to achieve. And what he did, he was down in Mpumalanga at the time, which is a province where a lot of our coal comes from in South Africa. And he basically went down there and spoke to the people that are going to be affected by the just transition. And what we did is we brought out those voices together to say that, you know, these people are up in the global north in very like well air-conditioned well-conditioned rooms, making decisions for people on the ground who, first of all, don't even know what COP26 is, who don't have an understanding of what COP26 means for them, who also have an idea of what a just transition is, but to a very certain extent, and have fears also around the just transition. And I think just pointing out that, that disparity to say that, you know, there's these high-level talks that are going on, and high-level talks on, and people who are not necessarily from the region making decisions about people who are very far removed, very far like divorced from what's going on. And I think just pointing that out for us was very important. And, you know, our newsroom did a great job in allowing us to tell that story and allowing us to actually put it as a front pager to say that, you know, this is something that's, the climate crisis, first of all, is very important to the region because we're the most impacted and we experience global average temperatures at twice the average rate. But also to say that, well, these talks are great, but who are they for? And who do they serve also? So, I mean, it's great for the EU and the partner countries to say that, you know, well, we funded, so that we're funding South Africa's just transition. And I think that we could be very proud of ourselves. Of course, they can say that. But at the end of the day, like when we come home and we use that money, like there are lives that are affected that are not being taken into consideration in this agreement. And I think it was very important for me as a reporter to do that. And I think I would urge other reporters who have opportunities like the one that I had from Climate Tracker to actually not only report on the announcements. And I think for me, the mentors that I had from Climate Tracker there did a good job in instilling that in me to say that, guys, look, yes, you guys are young, this is your first COP, and obviously your newsroom has an expectation of you to report on just the headlines, but also there's so many other things happening. Keep an eye out for that, keep an eye out for that. And I think that was very, for me, really shifted my thinking. And I think a really good call from the mentors from Climate Tracker, which I was very grateful for. So, I mean, I have so much more, but I think I'm going to leave it there, just, you know, in light of time constrictions, but obviously I'm open to answering any questions.
Okay, so before we move into asking the questions, I don't know if you wanted to talk about any policies that may come out of this before we move on to the question section.
Absolutely. I think that for me, the big one was, the phasing down of coal. I think that was very, obviously people are blaming, India and China for watering down, this progressive deal. But also I think African countries are in a way a bit relieved that it wasn't phased out, because if developed countries aren't able to actually to meet the 100 billion climate financing, how are they going to assist countries phase out coal by a certain time frame if they can't meet a measly $100 trillion when 100 billion, when they were able to mobilize about 20 trillion just for the pandemic within such a short space of time. So it's those questions, and it's so, I think, angering to kind of get a sense of who this COP is for, in terms of progress. It's progress for the developed nations, but also it's so many steps back for African nations and other developing countries. And they talk about phasing out coal, but also it's phasing out coal to move towards gas, which is also a fossil fuel. And Alok Sharma, the COP26 president, said in one of the press briefings, well, our focus is to phase out coal. We're not talking about other fossil fuels in this COP. And it's stuff like that where it's like, of course you're going to say that when the UK's one of the UK's primary source of energy is gas. Of course you're going to say that when there's a delegation of fossil fuel people who are most probably pulling so many strings, but also have their hand in gas in Mozambique. So for me, it was just like, yes, we want progress. Yes, we don't want to use coal anymore, but also these developing countries put developing nations onto coal. And now they're just saying, well, we're done. We want to move away and we want to look progressive, but you guys figure it out on yourselves, but do it. And I think South Africa, as much as there was some backlash from them not signing a lot of the pledges to move away from coal, because they say that, oh no, we don't get any money if we sign the pledges, but there's this expectation. And they're completely right. It's very unfair, but at the same time, it's like, I want to also see my country taking progressive steps to actually move away from coal. But it's like, how are they going to do that when countries are failing to meet their climate financing, and countries are not making any progressive steps to increasing that funding, or also actually make a separate financing facility for that specific cause. So it's a bit of a, there's two sides to it, and it's a bit of a tricky one, but also I think one that definitely needs more analysis and writing about, and constant engagement.
Okay, thank you so much, Onke, for your insights. I just want to ask a question. So before I do that, I just want to let everybody know that you can ask questions in the chat, and then we'll let Onke know about it. So my first question is, what are you looking forward to in Egypt in COP27? Because we know it's going to be here in Africa, on the continent. So what are you looking forward to? What should journalists be doing now that this global event is on our continent? What should we do ahead of that?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I kind of swore in the last COP that I'm not going to do this again, because it just felt so unprogressive, and I think I was just so angry at the lack of actual commitment for progressive climate action. But in the event that I do, which I most likely will, I think that journalists need to start, because we write about COP, right? And then COP ends, and then we move on and we write about other things, and we don't really reflect. I think that for me, it's very important that maybe once a month, we kind of pull in a COP story and be like, well, remember those agreements? Let's look how far you are. Like, what is the plan? To be constantly, because our role ultimately is to hold, these institutions and companies and everyone accountable. And so we need to be constantly looking at, the businesses that were there as part of our delegations, our governments, and constantly reminding them that, hey, like knock, knock, I'm still here, I haven't forgotten. What is your plan on the agreements that you made? What is the plan on, the final agreement that was signed on by the country? I think we need to constantly be doing that. And so that when when COP comes up and, the buildup is coming, we kind of have our ducks in a row and we're able to, and in a way, I think when someone is constantly being constantly held to account, then they want to take more ambitious action. And I think that's a way in which, as journalists, we can drive our countries to actually go to the COP with more ambitious goals, but also to make sure that they actually urge these countries to also make more progressive deals, and to also make progressive deals that are in line with African needs and also other developing countries' needs.
Thank you so much for that. And I totally agree with that. I mean, after COP26, we need to still keep our various countries on their toes, write about, environmental stories so that they know that we are holding them accountable and so that they can better prepare themselves for COP27. Thank you so much for that. Do you have any tips for journalists for reporting on environmental stories? Any tips for the journalists here?
Yeah, so I think when we think about the climate crisis, we tend to think of it at a global level. And I think for me, the most important thing that I learned before even becoming a climate reporter was that climate stories need to be linked, need a human angle always. Like if you just reporting, oh no, sea level rise and that's it, then people are like, oh, okay, cool. Like, why should I care? Whereas if you say that, there is a group of, and try to link it to your context. Make it local also, because I don't think there's enough of that. There's always, we want to report on the things that are going to catch a global audience. So I definitely say a human angle, and also zoning in on making it more local, more specific to your context and your surroundings, because I mean, no one knows your own area or country more than you. So try and zone it into something that your community will care about, and that will actually start getting people in your community or in your country or region to actually speak more about environmental issues and the climate crisis. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. I don't know if anybody in the audience would like to ask any question. The chat section is open. So I think Sanami and Onke are still on the call. So if anyone has any questions related to what they spoke about, they can ask questions. I think there was a question from Emmanuel. So Emmanuel was asking, I don't know who would like to take it, whether Sanami or Unke, but Emmanuel said that, okay, I think some of you answered it, but let me say his question again. So what stories can we pitch to continue the conversation on climate change?
I don't mind taking it. Yeah, like I said, I think following up with your delegation on how they're actually going to carry out a lot of the pledges, commitments, and NDC requirements that they've signed on to. I think also linking it to certain like climate events, so to speak, but also obviously not everyone is going to have like a disaster all the time. And you kind of want to also find a way to preempt those. So maybe looking at, you know, certain weather patterns, you know, just looking around your surroundings, like what's going on in my community, and trying to just link those to the climate crisis. So for me, I think it's very important to just zone in on where you are and look what's happening around, like why are the trees, you know, greening a bit later this year? Why are we still having rain in a certain month or season? Why is, you know, why is it still hot? Why hasn't the winter crept in? So just asking questions around your own environment, I think can be a very good way to continue to pitch environmental stories.
Thank you so much, Onke. Sanami, would you like to add to that?
Yes, and I think what I would like to add is to pitch accessible stories. And what I mean by that is that because climate change is so niche, so the conversations around it are technical. There's a lot of jargon around climate change. There's a lot of numbers. There's a lot of you know, big word in that, or big words in that sense of it. And so, if you want to get your audience to care, right? These are the people who have you know, varying attention spans, but it's mostly short, thanks to new media and all that it does. I'm grateful for it. So I think that if you want to tell stories, you have to think of beyond text, right? Beyond the typical stories you write in papers. Consider a mixed format when you're pitching your stories or when you're thinking of ideas. You know, if you have a story that you think would look great on paper or in a news website, ask yourself how this will look like in a TikTok video, right? Because you have higher chances of going viral and getting your message across, because the algorithm is so tailored to you and people that enjoy the same things that you enjoy. And so in that regard, you can control your sphere of influence, you can control your reach or the reach of your newsroom in that regard. So just reimagine how you tell climate stories, and also when you tell them, be less high sounding in the way you tell them. Use data journalism to your advantage. Visualize your stories instead of writing it out and making it wordy and heavy. You know, make it into fun charts or graphs or interactive, formats that your readers can engage with and they can understand. You know, tell pictures with stories. If there was a lake in your country that was full as at, I don't know, October this year, and but it has receded, and you know that by October next year it's still going to recede further. Document it, right? And then when October next year comes, document that as well, to see and then show people visually, let them know what is happening. So you can't just see the lake chart, for example, is disappearing, and people are still swimming in the lake chart. There's still fish coming from the lake chart, right? People have to be able to see the lake chart shrinking to be able to panic about it or to be concerned about it, because for many people it's not happening in their immediate environment, that they don't know what the relevance of that is, or to them or to the people around them. So make your stories accessible. Consider your audience. The people who care about climate stories are young people these days. The old people have failed us. I always say that generation has failed us and continue to do so. But the people who will inherit the earth, the people who will inherit this world that is being destroyed right now by inaction and all of that, are young people, and they are the ones whose voices need to be amplified. So key into mediums that young people are engaging with heavily, and find how you can tell your stories using those mediums.
Thank you so much, Sanami. I think it's really important in an era where people have very short attention spans. It's very good to consider new media and engaging them through those media so that we can keep people engaged, especially Gen Z, since they are the new generation coming up. Okay, so we have now reached the end of our discussion. And before we say goodbye, can we all put on our cameras? We want to take a group picture. We want to take a group picture for the Community Hangouts. So if we could all put on our cameras. Thank you all so much. I think there's still a few with their cameras off. Thank you so much, guys.
All right, like you can smile in 2 seconds. 1, 2. I see some people, more people coming on. All right, I'm gonna do that again. 1, 2. Nice, thank you.
So thank you so much, guys. Thank you all for joining the second edition of the Africa Community Hangout. I personally truly enjoyed this discussion. I feel like it was very informative. I know that the community will enjoy this as well. So I don't know if you realize this call was recorded. So if you missed out anything during the presentation, you can rewatch it. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask me again. And I just want to let you know that I'll be attaching the links to our various groups into the chat in a few minutes, so that if you have any questions after the presentation, you can just get back to me either on our Telegram or on our Africa Facebook group. Feel free to send me any questions that you have. Thank you so much, guys. I think I'm having issues attaching those links, but I will email them to you because I have your email addresses. So you can just WhatsApp me or send me a Telegram or message me in the Africa community groups on Facebook, so that we can have some kind of further discussion on whatever was discussed here. So thank you so much to everyone, to Onke, to Senami, to Dr. Ferrell, who left some minutes ago into the webinar. So thank you so much, guys, and I hope you had a lovely time. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.